is completely consumed by the war in Iran. It is the war in Ukraine that is reaching new, unprecedented heights. Indeed, new records are being broken specifically by one side, that of the Russians, and not good ones either. Indeed, it has now been the single largest day of casualties for Moscow since the war began, and arguably since the Second World War. Dwarfing anything that they've seen before, their 10 years in Afghanistan, or the years of the Chechen wars. So Russia's not only running through troop numbers, it's also running out of something far more dangerous in a war of attrition: money. Yes, Russia is literally running out of money, because behind the headlines about the battlefield, something much more revealing is happening yet again in this short space of time inside the Kremlin. Putin is personally asking Russian oligarchs to step in and help stabilize the state finances. And so that reveals something important. That this war is no longer just one funded by what's left of energy revenues or reserves. It's a system that is straining itself, and as I've argued before, largely eating itself alive. So in this video, I wanted to break down this huge development, what it means for Russia's finances, and why it matters far more than we could possibly imagine, as Putin is asking the very people to fund the very things that he is destroying. This is the Global Gambit. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back. Just dropping a quick video here because when I saw these developments, these headlines, I felt it was absolutely imperative to make a quick update video about the situation. The casualty numbers, as we know, are absolutely insane. There's been plenty of coverage of that by sister channels. But I wanted to look at the economic angle of this to complement them, because what's happening on Russia's front lines really are just but one angle. And if Putin is, despite what's being claimed about the oil revenue, having to ask the oligarchs to help fund his war machine, it shows you just how much of a finite lifespan, the timeline left, Putin really has to keep things under control for his war against Ukraine. But as always, I wonder what you guys think. How genuine is this financial pressure? Let me know in the comments. Now, at first glance, this does sound like routine because Putin often meets Russia's top businessmen behind closed doors. A few oligarchs offer to contribute money to the state. The Kremlin has denied any formal request, and officially, none of this is ever about the war. But that surface level narrative misses this real signal in this case, because it's the first time that Putin has directly engaged the oligarch class in a way that since the full-scale invasion began. And in Russia's system, as always, that really matters because it's not like philanthropy, it's not voluntary. This is a political signal wrapped up in plausible deniability. The Kremlin says it is the oligarchs' idea, and the oligarchs say that they're happy to contribute. Everyone plays a role, it keeps this mask and sense of narrative going, but the underlying reality is much simpler. The state needs money, the Kremlin needs money, and more importantly, it needs more money than is existing comfortably in the system or is being generated by the system. Now, to understand why this is happening now, you have to look at the scale of Russia's spending. To take a step back, Russia's defense budget has served to over 13 trillion rubles. So that's up more than 40% in a single year, which was up a significant amount of percentage points on the year prior to that. So that's not a marginal increase. It's a structural shift to a full-time war economy. Simultaneously, the revenues have been under pressure for a long time. Sanctions have forced Russia to sell its oil at unprecedented discounts. Buyers have become much more cautious, especially with the war in Iran. And the budget deficit has already surged to over 90% of its annual target within just the first 2 months of this year alone. That's an extraordinary pace of deterioration. And so what does the Kremlin try to do? Well, it tries to, of course, extract more from the system. VAT being raised to 22%, windfall tax is imposed on major companies, and now we see the next step: direct contributions from the highest of the high, the business elites. And that is unquestionably an escalation, an internal escalation, which will put a growing sense of paranoia on the back of Putin's neck that hasn't necessarily been there as much as it once was. And it tells you that the existing mechanisms are just no longer sufficient. But take this all into consideration with this very key point, which is because once a system starts relying on ad hoc extraction, you could argue, whether it's windfall taxes, forced contributions, or informal pressure, it doesn't stop there. It's a downward spiral, and you can already see the next layers beginning to form. Russia is not just taxing more, it's changing how capital behaves inside the system completely. Businesses are shifting off book to avoid the rising costs. Cash demand is increasing despite efforts to digitize. And the state is increasing, and the state is responding by tightening the control, restricting the outflows, removing the internet, and all those other elements that we saw just a couple of weeks ago. And basically just trying to trap liquidity inside the domestic economy, keep that money, the cash flow in Russia. So that's a negative feedback loop, because the more the state extracts, the more businesses try to protect themselves. And so the more that they protect themselves, the more the state intervenes. And over time, that erodes any trust that remains in the system and therefore the governance of Putin, of the Kremlin. And so this is where things start to become really fragile, much more than you can look at purely based on surface level figures. Because a war economy doesn't just depend on the resources, it of course depends on the confidence. Part of the speculation around how badly the war in Iran could have on markets is based on confidence, because confidence that contracts will be honored, confidence that capital won't be arbitrarily seized, confidence that today's rules will still apply tomorrow. Once you lose confidence in the markets, the system doesn't collapse overnight, but it becomes near impossible to sustain at the same level of efficiency or operation. And that's the phase that Russia is now moving into. And this is where it gets particularly interesting for me, because officially, of course, the Kremlin denies everything. Putin hasn't asked for money. These contributions are only voluntary. And crucially, though, the money isn't for the war actually at all. But the context always tells a different story. Apparently, at the same meeting, Putin had made it clear that Russia intends to continue fighting until it captures the remaining parts of the Donbass. So you have a situation where the state is increasing spending, expanding the taxation, and now tapping into private wealth, while simultaneously committing to a prolonged conflict, which increasingly can't be popular even amongst the elites. The official story is always about stability. The real story is about mobilization, but not necessarily in troop numbers this time, in financial figures. Then, of course, there is one factor that has terror temporarily. Now, I do want to address the illusion of relief in the war in Iran. Of course, oil prices have surged, giving Russia a short-term boost, up to around $150 million a day in additional revenue. And that looks great, but it's relief. Indeed, Putin doesn't believe it will last, and he's not an idiot. So he has reportedly warned both the finance ministry and business leaders not to rely on this windfall at all. And that's critical, of course, because it shows that even at the highest level, the highest echelons, there is an understanding that this is temporary and ultimately not going to fix the structural fallout that Russia is suffering, something I've made countless times in previous videos you should go and watch. It's not a solution, it's just a pause. And in war economies, no amount of temporary relief masks the structural integrity, the inability for the country to just function. And so the story therefore expands beyond that, beyond the taxation, because alongside the financial pressures, the Kremlin is tightening control over capital itself. New restrictions bans individuals from taking large amounts of cash or gold out of the country. Gold exports above 100 grams are now being restricted. Cash transfers above $100,000 are being limited. And the response is a growing problem. Capital flight. As you see a brain drain of Russians or just educated individuals wanting to leave the country, well, that leaves a growing vacuum of cash. In January alone, over $13 billion in cash left Russia's banking system. Businesses are moving into the shadow economy even more than before, and gold is being used as a substitute for foreign currency in illicit transactions. Simply put, money is trying to leave the system faster than the state can contain it, and that just adds to the warning signs. With that all in mind then, where does this all add up to? Now, there are three ways we could interpret what we're seeing. A sense of manageable pressure, that Russia can adapt somehow. The central bank is able to extract the resources and sustain the war in the short to medium term. Second, there is the much higher structural strain. The system continues functioning, but at the ever-increasing cost, lowering growth, weakening the private sector activity, and deepening reliance on the state control, which makes us really wonder just how many years or if months is that possible. Or third, the early stages of this much more clearly, to me, deeper problem. A system that begins to lose efficiency, where capital flight accelerates, taxation is so aggressive, and the state has to intervene on just anything, means it's not tenable. Even if Russia doesn't collapse financially, each step in this direction makes the system less flexible, dynamic, and dependent on coercion or foreign influence. Ultimately, this isn't just about plugging a budget gap. It's about the direction of the system itself. What you're seeing now is Russia effectively shift from a semi-market economy, one constrained by the sanctions and not getting much relief from the oil revenues, to a much more reflective state-led economy. Moreover, the deeper issue is what this does to incentives. Things like investment gets crowded out by state demand. Productivity suffers as capital is redirected into politically prioritized and charged sectors rather than efficient ones. Private businesses operate with less certainty, more arbitrary extraction, and fewer reasons to expand domestically. And so the longer this continues, the more the system relies on the coercion rather than the growth to sustain itself. This is how war economies in this point in time become path dependent. Even if revenues stabilize or the oil prices provide that relief, the underlying structure has shifted so far in that there's nothing you can do. Reversing it by restoring trust, capital mobility, and so on is far harder than simply financing another year of war. And so in that sense, the most important change here isn't whether Russia can keep paying for the conflict. It's that cost of doing so is steadily reshaping the entire economy, and how much can Putin accept that he has to make some concessions or agree to a less than favorable outcome, or just spin the narrative to the Russian people that Russia has won in liberating the Russian people in the broader Donbass region. So what we're seeing now is not just about pressure. It's about a transition from a system that can absorb shocks to ones that not only has to increasingly manage them, but just accept them. And from a model that relied on revenue to one that relies more on extraction, an extraction in the rawest of senses. From an economy that still has degrees of flexibility of choice to one that has become so rigid, so controlled, and dependent on any political direction that it ultimately cannot sustain itself. So the real question here isn't just whether Russia can afford this war today, but how much it can keep funding it over the days to come. But that's it from me, everyone. Let me know in the comments what you think. Give the video a like and subscribe, and consider supporting me further or joining me on Substack as well. And click on this video here to understand the perspective of China and Russia over the Iran war. Take care.